I'm Stephen Scheuer, welcoming you to another in our series of oral histories in which we are fortunate indeed to be able to interview those persons who have helped shape the style and substance of television and our major media today. Our guest today, Edwin Newman, is a longtime distinguished veteran of NBC News and author of several indispensable books dealing with language and writing, including, Strictly Speaking, Will America Be the Death of English? Mr. Newman has served as an essential member of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary and is the author of the book, A Civil Tongue. As critics have correctly noted, a civil tongue, coupled with an elegant mind, is rare indeed in television today. In this interview, I had to watch my P's and Q's. We began at the beginning. You're a native New Yorker, and you attended high school here before going on to the University of Wisconsin. How did you happen to decide on Wisconsin, for example?
I'm afraid this is not a very enlightening answer, but my brother went there before I did. So in a way, we chose it together, but in those days, New York did not have a state university system. Did have City College of New York, but my grades weren't good enough to get me in there. And I wanted to go away, wanted to go out of town as my brother had before me. So luckily our parents were prepared to make the sacrifices involved in enabling us to do that. Wisconsin had a reputation as being a progressive state. Its university was...
Governor La Follette and all
yes,
those liberal
the La Follettes, yes.
figures.
And the university itself had a very, very splendid reputation, which I
had
must
a strong
say, I
political
think,
science department, if I remember
yes,
correctly.
and I think it deserved that. And as you say, had a strong political science department, and poli-sci was what I studied.
Mm-hmm.
More or less.
Right. And you went from there directly to graduate school at Louisiana State University?
I got a fellowship at Louisiana State University in government.
Uh-huh.
But foolishly, after one semester, I left. So I never did get my MA. I left because I had taken a civil service examination, federal government. What was it called? I think it was called administrative assistant, something like that. And I was offered a job at the Department of Agriculture.
In Washington?
In Washington, the Bureau of Agricultural Chemistry and Engineering, it was at the department.
And Henry Wallace spotted you as a comer.
And, but it was a terrible mistake. It was not something I was fitted for, and I just didn't find it terribly interesting. And after a couple of months, they said to me goodbye. and I really did I failed at that job. That would be the simplest way to put it. Well, that meant that there I was in Washington with no income, to put it mildly. And a friend of mine told me about an opening, a fellow I'd worked with on the college paper at the University of Wisconsin, Dick Davis, still a friend, as close as he can be. Went on to become a distinguished journalist himself in the Washington Bureau of Newsweek, and then went on from there. But he told me about an opening at INS in Washington, International News Service, as a dictation boy.
What does that mean?
What is a dictation boy? Well, the main job of a dictation boy was to sit at a typewriter in the office of INS, let us say, and as the reporters out on the beats telephoned in their stories, he typed them. So and I got the job because I could touch type. And you sat at a desk, you wore headphones, the reporters called in their stories. On the floor under the desk there was a little device which you tapped with your foot when you had typed the phrase, the clause that the reporter had given you. And definitely was he in those days, We can talk about that later. But the reporter dictated, punctuation and all. President Roosevelt today, so-and-so, comma,
semicolon, or who knows
yes, period, paragraph.
Right.
Well, INS hired me, but it hired me for a different kind of dictation boy job at the beginning. INS was in competition with the United Press and the Associated Press. It did not have the same size staff. It had many fewer reporters. And up on the hill, on Capitol Hill, because it had fewer reporters than the competition, it needed somebody who would telephone in the stories that the reporters had written. Now, when you got a really big story, a fast-breaking story, the reporter had no time to type it. He would just pick up the phone, maybe shout bulletin, a hot bulletin, or an extraordinary conditions flash, and dictate it. He didn't have time to type it, but if he had time to type it, as I say, INS didn't have as many reporters as the others, so their reporters would hand what they had typed to a dictation boy who would telephone in the stories so that they didn't have to spend that time on the phone but could get back to covering whatever the news was.
What was the distribution mechanism? It was essentially an organ to syndicate in whatever form news. Did it go from there directly to newspapers or to radio stations? What was the nature of the transmission?
Well, it went to newspapers. There were radio stations in those days, but that was very definitely a secondary consideration. In those days, and I think it is not possible to understand what the competition was like then without this knowledge. In those days, there were morning papers, there were afternoon papers, there were evening papers, all across the country. So at almost any time of day, there was a newspaper, or there were newspapers that were about to hit the streets. So the competition among the wire services to get their stories in first was tremendous. And the competition to get the stories in a catchy form, especially with a good, strong lead, again was tremendous. The competition was would now be unimaginable because to some extent it was physical. If you were, let's say, you were a wire service guy covering the White House, President held a news conference, President Truman, let's say, you would run out of that news conference into the booth, and each wire service had its own booth in the White House press room. You'd literally run. You were hoping to get into your booth a few seconds before the opposition did. The competition...
That was a meaningful difference.
Yeah, it could be if some paper was about to come out, big story came in, which wire service got in with it first, which wire service got in with it with the catchier lead. Well, so up on the hill, then the reporters would hand me their stories to read. And as you can imagine, this was wonderful training because I was there. I would be there at the Senate. I was on the Senate side at the committee hearings, let's say, or up in the press gallery for the Senate as a whole. I'd see what was going on, and then I would see how the reporters reported it. It was the best kind of training imaginable. No study of journalism could equal it, and it was training you got on the job and very, very quickly. Well, after a while...
Saying how it changed between the copy that your reporters gave you and how the newspapers actually used it.
Well, what the main thing was you saw how an expert, like, let us say, the head of the INS's top man up on the Hill, Bill Neal, who was a real veteran, how he handled the stories that you saw breaking right in front of you. And it was... You saw how the experts did it. You were right there. It was so that when your time came to be a reporter, you had a pretty good start. Well, anyway, INS pulled me into the office, and I did the dictation boy stuff at the other end, typing what they called in. And then after some months, I heard about an opening at the United Press for the same job, which paid a bit more. I'd hate to tell you what the sum was. And but I was living in a rooming house in Washington. And
A $10 or $15 difference was meaningful money at that time.
Oh yes, it wasn't anything like that. It was a difference of $7 a week, but it amounted to a lot, yeah. So I went over to the UP in the same job, and in fact I remember working on December 7th, 1941. I was sitting at the typewriter.
Oops, a story about a Japanese bomb.
Yes, and typing. You can imagine the number of bulletins and flashes that came in that day.
Mm-hmm.
And then after Pearl Harbor, as some of the reporters were sent off as war correspondents and some went into uniform, I was promoted to a reporter, so that when I got back at the end of the war, I had a reporter's job to go to.
When you were working at CBS, working with Severide and Trout, and then in London, the London Bureau was staffed by extraordinary caliber people at that time, by Ed Murrow and Collingwood and others. Did you have a sense even then that these were people of uncommon gifts as journalists?
Well, yes, I had met Ed Murrow, and who was very kind to me. In fact, when I was still working for Eric Severide,
mm-hmm.
and I had met Murrow then.
What was your initial reaction to Murrow?
Well, I was in awe, understandably. And as I say, he was a true gentleman in this. He treated people in the same way, those on his level and those below him, and I was certainly below him. He was as courteous and kind as he could be. In fact, years later, I went to visit him when he was head of the USIA, just pay my respects.
In the Kennedy administration.
Yes, and as it happened, he died very shortly thereafter. I was one of the honorary pallbearers at his service here in New York for him. But, well, yeah, he was, it was almost unimaginable, the reputation, the aura that hung over Ed Murrow.
Most of it at the time was from his wartime radio broadcast from London during the bombing and so on.
Yes. And of course, I think later on he was responsible for what may have been the single most important, call it documentary of all time, the one about Senator Joe McCarthy.
I see it now in 1954.
Yes, I think maybe that was the single most important documentary ever done.
Tell us your reactions to seeing that program about McCarthy at the time.
Well, I was overseas at the time. Steve, I was in London. Of course, it was a big story there, too, and the program actually was shown there.
On the BBC or wherever?
It must have been on the BBC. It's almost impossible to exaggerate it, even to understand its importance, and its importance as a broadcast and its importance in influencing the history of our time.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's never been another one like it. Certainly another one that Ed Murrow did about migrant workers.
Harvest of Shame.
Yes, that was tremendously important also. But I was saying the head of the CBS Bureau when I was there was Howard K. Smith.
Another remarkable journalist.
Yes, you mentioned Charles Collingwood. I had met him in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
But Howard K. Smith was the chief of the Washington Bureau in London in those days. Paul Niven was there as well. Howard had written a book that had made a tremendous impression on me years before, called Last Train from Berlin, about his experiences in getting out of Berlin at the time the war broke out.
And what life was like in Hitler's Germany at that time.
A very fine book, very fine indeed. Howard was a gentlemanly, kindly person individually, personally, and did his best to help me. I was a stringer for NBC, but he did try to steer me to work so that I could, for the sake of my income. And he
very gracious of Howard, of
course.
Yes,
and he was. He was that kind of fellow. And of course, again, a tremendous broadcaster, really a very important broadcaster, so that when you actually were in the NBC bureau and you knew you were in competition with him, it could be challenging.
How would you characterize Howard's strengths at that time?
Well,
and what way was a motivation for you folks?
First of all, his voice, which was a deep, resonant voice with a sufficient Southern accent to make him distinctive. But then he spoke with authority. You knew that he knew what he was talking about. He had a measured delivery. You knew that he was respected by the people he was covering, that the British government, in effect, and the British politicians, in effect, knew who he was and considered his point of view an important one, and that if they wanted to get their message across to the United States or seem to be important in the United States, which was a key thing in those days in Britain, Howard was somebody that they had to know. I don't like to use the term cultivate, but he was a man who could pick up a phone and get to talk to anybody he wanted to talk to, which is a big thing when you're a reporter.
When one looks back now on the caliber, and I don't want to test your NBC loyalties too much, but one looks back at the caliber of the CBS News team in those years, from Murrow to Howard K. Smith to Collingwood to Winston Burdett to all the others that followed, Severide and Dan Shore, it does seem to me sometimes that that's a lineup that's never been matched in television journalism since then.
I think that's true. Of course, what we're talking about there essentially is radio journalism. Right. It's turned into television journalism. But CBS had a position then, a reputation then, that I think has never been equaled. Partly because NBC came along and provided much more competition when in a sense, the evident superiority of CBS became a matter of some embarrassment to NBC, and in particular to General Sarnoff. And so changes began at NBC, and
which was stimulated by Robert Kintner when he assumed the presidency of NBC
Very much so,
News.
yes. And we really began to compete with CBS, but before that, no. CBS definitely dominated the field.
Surely, and throughout virtually all of the 1950s,
yes.
that would have been true.
I should say that when I got to London and started stringing for NBC, the London correspondent was Merrill Muller, called Red Muller, and Red had been a correspondent for Newsweek before he went to NBC. He simply did not have the kind of reputation that that the opposition did. Howard K. Smith, in those days, it was practically speaking no ABC. That came later. And this was not entirely Red's fault. It was NBC didn't take its news department that seriously. It didn't try to build it up. It didn't publicize it. It didn't promote it. It didn't give it the time on the air that CBS had. It wasn't until somehow General Sarnoff felt, as I say, somewhat embarrassed, and his son Robert Sarnoff felt somewhat embarrassed by the evident superiority or the greater respect in which CBS News was held. It wasn't until then that they began to build up NBC News.
What were the first signs of that to you and others at NBC News, that it was being taken more seriously?
Well, we got much more time on the air. That was, we were given more programs. In the early days, NBC had a radio program early in the morning, and you would do what were called spots, a minute and a half for those, but that was about it. There was another program called Alky, A-L-K-Y, which was short for Alka-Seltzer, which sponsored a fellow named Morgan Beatty. And they began taking spots from overseas, too. That helped. That was a 5 nights a week show. But it was when when they began bringing in camera equipment, when television came along, when we began doing documentaries, when we began doing reports for evening shows for the Today Show. The Today Show made a tremendous difference. When that came into being, the news correspondents began to be important to it. The ones in this country, in particular the ones in the studio in New York, but also those of us who were overseas, we were submitting spots for the Today Show. Occasionally we'd go on live. We'd go on live, in effect,
in those early years with Dave Garroway.
Yes.
Right.
And the live broadcasts, in effect, were radio broadcasts. We couldn't be seen. We'd be in the studio at Broadcasting House, the BBC, and talking on a radio circuit to Dave Garroway. But we were on the air, and this was a television program. The Today Show was tremendously important in the development of NBC News.
During this time when you were living in as a correspondent for NBC News, during that time you were based in Europe, were you living in London most of that time?
Yes, yes. Lived in London until 57 when I was transferred to Rome.
Right. And what was most folks don't understand the remotest notion of how television foreign correspondence would work. What was the decision-making process when you were told to go from London to cover this story? How many reporters were on the ground elsewhere in Europe, and how did they decide whether it was a story of sufficient importance for you to go?
Well, as television expanded, NBC had many bureaus: London, Rome, Paris, Bonn, Berlin.
Where they had staff in each of these places?
Yes, Moscow. There was Cairo, Israel, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires had bureaus, and I think some others at various times that I haven't mentioned as well. The authority was in New York, and generally speaking, unless there was something tremendously pressing, you didn't go off on assignment unless New York told you to. But of course, you had regular assignments. If you were in London, for example, you certainly would want to spend a fair amount of time at the House of Commons, even if there was no immediate story. But very often there was, especially in the days of Winston Churchill, or in the days of the Labour government. You'd spend a lot of time at the House of Commons. There were various British prime ministers who had American reporters in periodically, regularly. Churchill was not one of them. He had nothing to do with the press. But so we would find ourselves at 10 Downing Street every couple of weeks, having an off-the-record session with the Prime Minister, probably. Eden,
this might have been Attlee, or?
Well, it was more the Conservatives,
right.
But yeah, I had something to do with Clement Attlee, and in fact, he even came to the NBC office once to take part in the program. And
so the decision as to whether you would go from London to elsewhere in Europe were made in London or by the New York headquarters?
They were principally made in New York. For example, very early in the days of television, I was sent to what was then the Suez Canal zone in Egypt, and from there to do a story there about whether the British could hope to retain the Suez Canal, which of course they could not. And from there,
somebody named Nasser had designs on the canal, if I remember correctly.
And from there, I went to Kenya, because in Kenya then there was the Mau Mau uprising, that is to say, an uprising by native Kenyans against the British rule, and so we did about. Must have been gone 2 or 3 weeks, I guess.
So you'd fly to Nairobi for a series of pieces.
We flew to Cairo.
Right.
To do what was a half-hour program about whether the British could hope to stay there in the canal zone, and then we flew to Nairobi and went out into the countryside, the jungle, and so on, to do a story about the Mau Mau. And it would be unimaginable now to anybody who is not alive then the amount of equipment that we had to take with us. The
cameras were so massive, for
yes,
example.
and the size of our crews, the number of people who went off.
What would be an example of that, as you correctly
well,
say? Folks today don't understand, but they think of the earlier versions of the minicam.
In those early days, we had a tremendous amount of equipment, but we had much smaller working teams, much smaller crews. I would go off with a cameraman, a sound man, maybe a director or a producer, maybe one other camera crew person, but usually it was just 3 or 4 of us. Many fewer than go off on these stories now. And in those days, we didn't send out advance people either to tell us what the story, to survey the thing and tell us what we were going to be doing.
You didn't have the staff, or they didn't figure it was necessary, or both?
Well, both, really. And these were the early days, and there was no experience of this kind of thing. So off we would go and do our best when we got there. Now, of course, if you're doing a story about the Suez Canal Zone at a time when NBC had its own bureau in Cairo, as it did, that meant that there were NBC people on the ground who would help you, but at the same time, in a way, you were dishing them out of the story, so it was a bit tricky. As it happened,
But the New York office wanted the well-known figures of their major correspondents on the air most of the time.
Yes, or it wanted somebody with experience.
Right.
Also, or it wanted a particular camera crew because that cameraman was thought to be particularly good, and there was one in particular, a fellow I worked with very often named Guy Blanchard in the London Bureau, who after some years went over to ABC and unfortunately was killed in an airplane crash.
What would be the skills of a cameraman that made one much more desirable than another?
Well, imagination for one thing, and getting camera angles that another cameraman might not think of. And Guy was really was a movie. He was a movie cameraman, and besides being a delightful fellow personally. So his work was particularly valuable. But as I say, we had a Cairo bureau, and because I went there, I became very friendly with the Cairo correspondent, a fellow named Wilson Hall, who is gone now, has died some years ago, but Wilson had a long career at NBC also. But it was much more convenient for the people in New York to have the London crew go out because it had some experience, and it wasn't until later that camera crews were established in all of these other places. Now NBC had a staff cameraman in Cairo whose name was Mohammed Ez El Arab, and we became friends, and Ez he was always called. But he was, and I was in fact, I substituted for Wilson Hall for a while in Cairo for a few months.
You lived in Cairo
Yes,
for a few months?
Yes,
Wow.
and
Amazing.
And Ez was our cameraman, but Ez was a patriotic Egyptian, and he hated to take pictures of anything that seemed to him to be not complimentary.
Like poverty, for example.
to his country, which created certain problems in covering the news. But
in 1956, your colleagues Chet Huntley and David Brinkley had scored a significant triumph for their coverage of NBC News in '56. How did that affect the coverage of NBC in 1960?
Well, the success of Huntley and Brinkley made a tremendous difference. It gave NBC a position it had not had before, a degree of esteem it had not had before, and a share of the audience.
Big share.
It had not had before. So if you were part of the team, you in effect benefited from the existence of Huntley and Brinkley, and just that combination of names itself seemed to have some sort of magic, leaving aside the way they worked together.
What was the nature of the chemistry between them?
Well, of course, Chet stayed in New York, David stayed in Washington. And but it got to the point, I think, where one almost never heard the name of one without hearing the name of the other. And considering the degree to which they were associated in the public mind, the degree to which that Huntley-Brinkley thing became almost automatic, considering all of that, I thought they really got on very well. I think if one never heard one's name alone, almost, one could come to resent the other half of the formula. But as far as I know,
supposing it had been Morrow Newman, you could have dealt with that over
yes,
the years.
But I think, considering the degree to which they were associated in the public mind, they got on remarkably well. And as I say, it was the kind of thing that might have created resentment, but they worked together so well.
What was the nature of Chet Huntley's gift?
I think the principal nature of Chet Huntley's gift was evident friendliness, decency. And he and I were rather friendly. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had a lovely letter from him, as it worked out, not very long before he passed on. And Chet had a certain natural dignity, but it wasn't anything overbearing. It was no conceit. He wasn't stuck up, as we used to say when we were young. And there was an openness about him, that a genuineness about him that I think shone through, really. And he was that kind of fellow. On Meet the Press, of course, I was working with its creator and producer, Larry Spivak, right. And whose part in the history of television news is of tremendous importance, as you know.
Well, for those folks who don't know, tell us about it briefly. What was his contribution?
Well, Larry was a journalist, a magazine journalist, in fact, American Mercury. But he got the idea of Meet the Press as a radio program, and it was Meet the Press. You had the moderator of Meet the Press, and then you had 4 questioners, all of whom were from the press, from the written press, as we now have to say. And week after week, because important people usually in Washington were coming on, this program was producing news. It was really of vast importance in the politics of the country. To be invited to be on it meant that you were, to be invited to be on it as a guest meant that you were a national figure. If you were not a national figure before, you became one. So it did play a great part in American political life.
Surely was a factor in the greatly increased importance of the Sunday news panel shows now.
Yes, indeed. It was really the pioneer in that respect. And because of Meet the Press, you got Face the Nation. Mm-hmm. And then you got the ABC.
With David Brinkley's journal?
Yes,
right.
But all of that began
right.
with Larry and with Meet the Press. And well, he and I were friends personally, and Larry lived in Washington, and I often used to visit him there. And I think his part in the development of television news is perhaps not sufficiently appreciated. Now, there's another thing about him, of course, which was that Larry was not a broadcaster as such. He didn't have the broadcasting voice. He didn't have the delivery. You could never imagine him on another program. It was just this one program that he would do. He didn't have the accepted appearance.
Wasn't a charismatic figure in that sense.
You would never have put him on the nightly news or anything like that. Not that he would ever have wanted to do it. But there was this special, what's the word now, niche,
Mm-hmm.
and And as I say, he played a part in the history of the country, not only of television news. I think back to in a self-centered way, perhaps, to a series of television series I had called Speaking Freely, which was on the local station, NBC station in New York. And
approximately what period would that have been?
Let's see, it was in the 70s and 80s.
Right, okay.
And it was a 1-hour program in which I would interview a person, or at most 2 persons, if they were on together as a team. The program was not rehearsed. It was not edited. It was a 1-hour program.
On a weekend?
Yes, usually on a weekend. And the NBC station in New York made it available to all the other NBC owned and operated stations, and then gave it to public television stations all over the country. It was also heard on radio. Now, I'm not bringing this up to pat myself on the back, although if somebody else wants to do that, I don't mind. The point is, you cannot get a program like that nowadays. You cannot get an hour of discussion from literary people, political people, scientists, historians.
The only place that comes to mind now is the Charlie Rose Show on public television.
Yes, but again, the interviews don't go on that long.
No, they don't.
And
they tend to be 3 20-minute segments.
Yeah,
for the
which
most
I'm
part.
not saying in any critical way of that show. But we used to do 1 hour. I was never told, don't put this person on. I was never told, do put this person on. I was never told, change the program in this way, change it in that way. And
were there some shows with some guests that were particularly gratifying to you?
Well, yes.
And or newsworthy? What were some of them?
Well, there were many, but we did such a great variety of people. As I say, scientists like Thor Heyerdahl of Kentucky. We did any number of authors and historians, actors, actresses, playwrights, Arthur Miller. Did Muhammad Ali, for that matter. I went to Cherry Hill to do that. But it was generally thought to be an intellectual program. And the people at NBC never spoke to me about changing it, about putting on somebody, about not putting on somebody. They never tried to interrupt it for promos. They never tried to sell any time. I attribute this largely to an executive named Ted Walworth, who simply thought that this was a worthwhile project. Now, as I say, I'm bringing this up not to congratulate myself on it, but because it is thought now that you can't have a program like that the attention span of the public will not permit it. It won't get any kind of audience. If this program went all over the country, free. And I did a good many of the programs overseas, for that matter, with Britain and France, Germany, many places, and I just find it's a sad commentary on the state of American television, the state of American public life, that this kind of program just doesn't exist any longer.
One of your many strengths that was a source of wonder to me and other people who've been covering television for a long time was the dexterity you showed in covering what you called interrupts or extended, often sad occasions, whether it was assassination coverage of Kennedy or Robert, and then President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. It would seem like it's almost unimaginable pressure doing that. Talk about it and how you dealt with covering the Kennedy assassination coverage over those few days?
Well, I think
In 63.
I became, in a way, NBC's specialist in what we call network interrupts, when something would happen that was important enough to break into the programming and either briefly just to give the bulletin, or in some cases to stay on for hours, days even. And I think that my early training in wire service work helped me in this, because, as I was saying earlier, when you were a wire service reporter and there was something big broke that you were covering, what you had to do was just pick up the phone and dictate the story. There was no time to sit down and write it. You had to dictate it. And to some extent, this is what you did when there were network interrupts. And that's when President Kennedy was shot. I was not the one who did the network interrupt. In fact, I was at lunch, and there was a CBS man in the same restaurant who was telephoned and told to get, it was Dallas Townsend, a very nice, friendly guy. And as he was leaving the restaurant, he saw me and he said to me, "The president's been shot." Well, from that day on, when we had to leave word at the news desk where we had gone for lunch. Well, I ran back, and we were on the air with it on television, but not on radio, so I was assigned to radio. And I remember announcing President Kennedy's death. In fact, many times in the years since, when I've seen footage of that day, I see people gathered around an automobile listening to the radio, and they're hearing the announcement of President Kennedy's death, and it's my voice. Well, I remember being pulled off radio and told to go downstairs and get into a coach bus that NBC had chartered to take us to the airport, to fly us to Dallas. And I remember saying to an NBC...
That was the first part of that extended coverage, which
Yes.
lasted for some days.
Yes, and I remember saying to an NBC executive, Julian Goodman, "I have to go home. I have to change clothes. I cannot cover a funeral in this." And I was wearing a very light gray plaid. And he said, "There's no time, just go down and get in the coach." Well, we didn't go to Dallas, we went to Washington. And I was one of the team, and of course Huntley and Brinkley were the anchors, but I had a big part in it. And over the years, as I say, I became the specialist, and Martin Luther King Jr. was shot when Robert Kennedy was shot. I was the one who would be on for hour after hour after hour.
How did you prepare yourself for those eventualities and those kinds of baleful situations?
You say to yourself, is this really happening?
There were times in the spring of '68 that a lot of us wondered whether America had lost its sanity for the moment.
And you say to yourself, as I say, is this really happening? But yes, it is happening, and it's your job to report it. And again, I think, pat myself on the back, I don't mean to, but I think because of my background in wire service work, I had an ability to do this kind of thing that perhaps some of the people who didn't have that experience lack, through no fault of their own. But there was one famous occasion of a different kind, really, which I say famous because it got into the papers. It was reported in the newspapers. It was the time that Spiro Agnew resigned, and I was told to go on the air and announce his resignation as vice president. Well, there was an American League baseball playoff game on, so I ran down to the voice-over studio, not to go on camera, and to give the news of Agnew's resignation. And the producer said to me, "Well, wait till the inning is over." And I said, "No, it can't wait." And I knew enough as an old sports fan, I knew enough about baseball to know that the games are so slow these days, and the catcher throws the ball back to the pitcher, and the pitcher tugs at his cap and scratches himself and spits a few times and kicks the dirt and walks around the mound. So I said to the producer, put me on the air when you see the ball in the catcher's mitt, and I'll be off the air by the time the next pitch is delivered. And I was. And this, as I say, was picked up and reported in the papers the next day. I was very proud of it.
Because the pitcher in question didn't have much of a wind-up.
I was very proud of myself. But when you're in a position like that, when Martin Luther King Jr., let us say, was shot, one of the was an executive at NBC who said to me, maybe I shouldn't say this, it sounds as though I'm boasting, and he said, "You're more than a newsman, you're a national asset." Well, that's fine.
That true.
That's fine. This raises the question of how far you permit your personal feelings to affect what you're saying. Now, obviously, when in '68, given what had happened when King was shot, you wondered about and worried about the stability of the country. And
Was some part of your job to comfort the soul and body politic of the land at that time?
Not consciously, I think, but somehow by demonstrating is not the right word, but by not concealing
your affection and admiration for King?
Yes, and the effect it had on you and your worry about the country itself. Somehow this gets across, and it may have a useful effect on people. Of course, there's another element in this. Did you know the individuals? Well, I knew Martin Luther King Jr., of course. I had known Robert Kennedy. I had had very limited contact with President Kennedy, but some. But King I knew pretty well, and I was always struck by the burden he was carrying, and by the fact that he was so young, a fact that had been lost sight of, but the burden he was carrying for so young a man.
And his incredible prescience about his potential fate.
Yes, and I was also very much struck by his smile. It was a tremendous and winning smile. And so having had this personal contact with him, I'm sure that had some effect on what I was saying, but as you say, it was 1968, and with a succession of terrible events, you couldn't help but show some worry, some concern.
And one felt almost equally terrible, I know I did, on the occasion of the attempted assassination of Governor Wallace, George Wallace, who I did not admire as a person, but I felt equally badly that American paranoia or whatever.
Yes, that's another story I did, another breaking story.
Tell us about that.
I did that one. And again, he was a man I had had some contact with. It was actually on Meet the Press. But when you're in a position like that, the story breaks, you're put in front of the camera, and essentially at the beginning you're doing it alone. And as time goes by, of course, and producers come in and take over, and correspondents are brought in from other places, Washington, of course, among others, and you're no longer handling it alone. But at the beginning, when you are doing it alone, you are setting the tone of the coverage. And
for hours, in some ways, days to follow,
yes,
really.
And it's a tremendous burden. But again, that's something that you can't be too conscious of if you're a newsman, a news person. It's just part of the job. And again, as I say, I think my early training was tremendously valuable to me in dealing with this kind of thing. I mentioned the night that John Chancellor and I were on doing the Nixon resignation. We were both old newspaper men, and I think in some way that helped. But then there's another element.
It helped in what way?
Well, it helps you in keeping your composure. And you have to keep your composure. The public is relying on you, whether consciously or not, to give it the news, to give it the facts. And you have to decide, especially at the beginning, how far to let yourself comment on what is happening.
Or how much grief you can show.
Yes, and what the consequences, your view of what the consequences of a particular bit of breaking news may be. Do you confine yourself to what has happened? Do you talk about the possible consequences to the country, to the political party, if that's involved, to the particular group in the population? And as I say, these are decisions that you make on your own at the beginning, but as time goes by and the coverage becomes more organized, then you're getting cues and you're getting instructions.
Were some of the advice from your NBC colleagues of particular help in these kinds of stressful situations with
yes.
King, for example, or Robert Kennedy?
Oh yes, and this is something. I can give you an illustration of this on the night that Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run again, and I was doing the broadcast, and Johnson went on, and we had received an advance copy of his speech, but we had been told that it was not the entire speech, that there was another part. And we were led to believe that he was going to announce a trip somewhere overseas. Well, he got to the end of his script, and the producer, the director, very important point, the director in the control room began, as Johnson was getting toward the end of the script, the director began talking to me through the telex, saying, "Oh, Ed, remember, after he finishes, you hold it for 15 seconds and you throw it to so-and-so, and then you throw it to so-and-so, he'll hold it and give it back, and you throw it to so-and-so." But Johnson was speaking, and he was giving the part of his speech that we had not received. And of course, it was the part in which he was announcing that he would not run again.
Which was a momentous story at the time.
Yes, and which I did not hear because the director was speaking to me. Well, the producer in the control room, a fellow named Elliot Frankel, thought very fast, and he said to me, "We will repeat that part. We'll play it back." And I looked into the camera and said, "Well, I think you all heard what I did. Let's hear it again." And we played it again. And of course, it was Johnson announcing his decision not to run. Well, Elliot Frankel, the producer, who's now gone.
There's quick thinking on his part.
Quick thinking. He saved the day, the night. It was very quick thinking on his part.
And some modest embarrassment for some of you through no fault of your own.
And the director, who was a very good director, very conscientious fellow, he was only trying to be helpful, reminding me of what we were going to be doing, and hadn't realized that he was drowning out for me what President Johnson was announcing. So this kind of thing can happen. And as you're talking about getting helpful advice, yes, what Elliot Frankel did that night was indispensable, to say the least.
There was enormous pressure during Johnson's presidency, and in the enormous American involvement in the passions about Vietnam War, both for and against. I remember that there were enormous pressures on the different networks not to cover some of the major Vietnam protests that usually took place over a weekend and so on. Did you have any recollections of that or any involvement of what happened? Tell us about it.
I do remember the pressure that was brought to bear on the networks, but I thought NBC News did it very well and covered things extremely well and impartially, but properly. These things were news. Now, the Chicago Convention, of course, in
68.
you have a decision to make as a news person. Are these things being done just for you? Are they being done in effect for the cameras, or are they genuine? Would they be happening if the cameras were not present? It's a very difficult question to answer, given the part that television plays in American life, not only American life. You can't say, well, we're not going to cover this because they know we're going to cover this. Is it important in itself? It's a very difficult thing to decide, but undoubtedly there was a lot of ham acting by various individual demonstrators who, you can remember seeing them on the streets, and they were claiming to have been beaten up when they hadn't been, that kind of thing. On the other hand, there were those who had been. It's these are tough calls, and I think the answer, if there is an answer, is to acquaint the public with the facts of the situation, including the possibility that you are being used, if you think that possibility exists, but doing your best to tell people what is going on.
Well, I hope I won't be accused of ham acting when I say that your NBC News colleague was right. You are a national asset, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve.